Okay, so this is the second PilotEdge workshop. The first was an introduction to VFR flying with a deep focus on different types of airspace. And this will be the second VFR workshop where we really put it all together. We take what we learned from the first workshop and we'll be planning a series of VFR flights and going through the ATC communications involved in each of those flights. So the goal is to be able to walk away with a much better understanding of how you would go about planning a typical VFR flight, whether it's from a sleepy non-towered airport all the way up to, say, DFW or LAX and everything in between. Okay, this is really more for the wider audience who may not be familiar with PilotEdge. I know most people who are here are familiar with PilotEdge, but just for the sake of a wider audience who will be viewing this at a later date, let's go through the agenda very, very quickly. I'll give a slightly longer background than my last one. My last one was kind of comical, so I'll give a little bit more detail on my background, the goals of PilotEdge in these workshops, a one-slide review on VFR airspace, and then we're going to dive into the meat of the presentation, which is the scenarios and communications. For my background, my name is Keith Smith. I'm the founder and CEO of PilotEdge. I have a background in software architecture and software development, been doing that for 20 or so years. I'm an instrument-rated pilot, and I finally added it up. I have just around 500 hours of flight time, and I fly in lots and lots of different types of airspace. Again, I actually fly out of Lincoln Park, New Jersey, out of a small non-towered airport, but it's underneath some fairly busy airspace. And so I've flown in many different parts of the country in lots of different types of airspace. I'm also an avid sim enthusiast, been simming since I was about 8 years old. I'm now 38, so that's 30 straight years of simming. Got around 7,000 hours or so of virtual air traffic controller experience. So I've done it from both sides, both sim flying, real flying, and also the virtual controlling side. And I do have a obsession with ATC and the National Airspace System. I spend more time thinking about it than is probably healthy, and very, very passionate about it. And that's one of the things that led me to build PilotEdge. So that's me. What about PilotEdge itself? Goals of PilotEdge are to reduce the time and cost to train pilots by allowing them to practice virtually. It's very, very expensive to do it in the real world. Most casual or amateur pilots don't really get to practice as much as they should to stay safe and proficient, myself included. I either don't have the time or the money to fly in the real plane, and I use the sim extensively to stay sharp. And PilotEdge is designed to take that practice that you would do at home to a whole new level of realism and effectiveness. So we try and raise the bar for situational awareness and the ability for pilots to interact with ATC. Those are two of the things which are most lacking, I think, in most amateur pilots. And we want to provide as many learning opportunities as we can for the pilot community, which is how we came to doing these workshops. So the goals of the workshops are to provide a deeper hands-on understanding of the topics required to have an enjoyable PilotEdge experience. So there's only so much you can pick up on the scope and from reading books. I'm sorry, not on the scope, on the network. When you're flying in the sim on the network, it's a little bit like drinking from a fire hose sometimes. And so we've designed these workshops to allow people to interact with us in a more casual environment, not so hectic as the network, because as controllers we can't really provide as much feedback as we'd like. And so this is a perfect opportunity to get together and really go deep on these topics. And it won't just be me speaking. Hopefully other pilots will be chiming in with their experiences and their questions, and we can all learn from each other. As you can see, I am moving along as quickly as I can because we do have a lot to get through. So the goals of this workshop, we're going to go very deep on some end-to-end scenarios. That's not something we did in the last one. The last one we went very, very deep on each of the types of airspace. The goal of this workshop is to put that knowledge together and discuss practically how you would plan a flight from A to B. Let's see, we want to help build a practical working understanding of the decisions that go into VFR flight planning, and we will be covering the ATC interactions for each phase of flight on each of the flights that we discuss. So there'll be airspace considerations, flight planning considerations, and then we'll chair flight or virtually fly it, not in the sim, just for time constraints. We won't have time to do that, but we'll certainly simulate the ATC interactions for each phase of flight. Okay, airspace recap. So, remembering from our last presentation, these are the types of airspaces that we generally care about as a VFR pilot. You'll notice Class A or Class Alpha is missing from this. That's above flight level 180, not relevant to VFR flight, so we don't have to go through it. Class B, so we're going to go from busiest to the least busy, and that would be the most restrictive to the least restrictive. So Class B, examples of that would be Los Angeles and San Diego. You must have a clearance from ATC to enter that airspace. Class C airspace, the next level down, examples would be John Wayne and Burbank. To fly in or out of that airspace, you must be in communication with ATC. Next step down, Class D, Long Beach and Bakersfield. Actually, very similar requirements to the Class C. It's interesting that people are sometimes comfortable with Class D or Class Delta, but not very comfortable with Class Charlie. The actual requirements for flying in them are practically identical. You have to be in communication with ATC. I'm guessing one reason is that with the Class Deltas, you typically only have to talk to the tower. With the Class Cs, you typically talk with the approach facility, who will then hand you off to the tower. Maybe that's why people are less excited about the Class C. But we'll be going through examples of all of these during the workshop. And then we have Class E and G airspace, where no communications are required. So we'll be identifying during each scenario that we cover, we'll talk about what airspace we're in during each phase of flight and what the communication requirements would be. And a quick word about special use airspace, because some of our scenarios might involve that kind of airspace. So we have military operations areas, alert areas, and warning areas. Feel free to plow ahead through those. You do not technically have to speak to ATC to enter those. Is it a good idea? Not really, but you can do it. Restricted areas, you cannot enter unless you have permission from the controlling agency. So check first before you go into restricted airspace. And for prohibited airspace, you got a snowball's chance in hell. Don't even bother. Okay, here are the scenarios that we'll be going through during the workshop. They're broken down by the types of airspace or airports that we'll be dealing with. The goal here is not to cover every single unique combination that you could come up with, because there's an almost infinite number of them, or close to it, but I just wanted to cover the main categories. And once you understand these 4 different scenarios, you could then mix and match. So once you understand the logistics of departing and arriving from a non-towered field and departing and arriving from a Class Delta field, that's 2 distinct scenarios, you could then combine them. So you could do a non-towered to a non-towered departure with a towered arrival, or a towered departure with a non-towered arrival. So as long as you understand the different elements of each one, then you can mix and match. And by understanding all 4 of these scenarios, both the departure and arrival piece, there's really no flight that you would not be able to do under VFR, which is again, the stated goal of the workshop. So we'll do non-towered departure and arrival, then we'll go Class Delta departure arrival, Class Charlie departure arrival, then Class Bravo departure arrival. So you'll notice we're starting with the simplest, in quotes, first, and working our way up to the heavy metal stuff. Okay, look at that, 11 minutes from intro to the first scenario. That's not bad. I'm happy with that. So I cheated a little bit. As I was coming up with a scenario for non-towered, there's the truly very, very simple flight, and then there's one which may have some more considerations. And rather than trying to find one scenario that kind of covered both, I thought, let me cheat here and break this down into two slightly different scenarios. And there's a method to that madness. As a pilot, when I'm learning stuff, I like to have very simple, clear examples, and then I like to build on them from there. And so this first example of Paso Robles to King City is a very, very simple example. Let's go have a look at that. The goal here will be to go into a ton of detail. We're going to go through these examples in much, much more detail in terms of the flight planning side of things than we will on the other scenarios. We're probably not going to go into the same level of detail of flight planning on every single scenario, because some of it will be a little bit repetitive. And what I'd like to focus on the later scenarios is more the ATC communications and some of the airspace considerations, as opposed to how we're going to navigate the airplane. So this will be quite a long scenario, but don't be too concerned. Yeah, don't be too worried that we're going to run out of time, because you know, the next 3 or 4 that we go through will move a little bit quicker than this one. But I'm definitely going to take my time on these first 2 scenarios to make sure we're very comfortable with the basics of VFR flight planning. All right, let's go ahead and kick off with scenario 1A, which will be a flight from Paso Robles to King City. Okay, I'm going to pause really quickly here to see if everybody can see the material clearly enough, because we're going to be spending quite some time looking at this particular screen. I want to make sure it's coming up very clearly and people can read it, people can see the airport. So can everybody see that PRB, Paso Robles, is on the southeast corner and Mesa del Rey is on the northwest? Silly question, I shouldn't say can everyone see it, because then 24 people might just say yes. Can anybody not see it? Is anyone having trouble seeing the material? Excellent. Very good. Okay, so in that case, I'm going to remove the flight planning help that we have here from SkyVector. So we're just looking at the pure sectional chart here. The tool that I'm using, by the way, is skyvector.com. If anybody's not familiar with it, it is an unbelievably useful free utility that just gets better and better all the time. We have worldwide VFR, low en route, high en route charts with airport information and flight planning. So it's really quite amazing. But we're gonna keep it a little bit simple just to begin with. And right now I'm just simulating looking literally at a paper-based sectional. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about the I'm not going to do the ATC communication part yet. Let's talk about planning the flight from Paso Robles in terms of the routing and how we might execute the flight in terms of how we're going to navigate on this flight and what some different styles would be. So if I were planning this flight from Paso Robles to Mesa del Rey, I've been saying King City, but I guess it's actually called Mesa del Rey. One thing I'm going to exclude from the discussion would be the use of GPS navigation. Practically speaking, it would be a fantastic idea if you do have either a handheld GPS or a panel-mounted GPS. Absolutely nothing wrong with using that, especially as an experienced pilot who's already comfortable with the basics of navigation. Definitely nothing wrong with using a GPS to help you on this flight. However, I would definitely urge people who are learning about navigation and just getting comfortable with flying. Believe it or not, I think you're actually better off not using GPS for these flights, because it can very, very quickly become a crutch. And as much as you're telling yourself that you're using it for situational awareness, in quotes, what really is happening most of the time is you'll be flying primarily off the GPS and then looking for things outside to correlate with what you're seeing on the GPS. And it's a slightly insidious mistake. You can go with the best of intentions, but I've seen this happen both with myself and other pilots. When I was learning to fly, we'd think we were just using the map, and then someone would switch it off, and all of a sudden we'd be a lot less comfortable. And if you find yourself switching off and becoming a lot less comfortable, then the truth was you were actually navigating with the GPS and correlating with what you were seeing outside, and it should really be the other way around. So let's rule out the fact that you really could just dial direct Paso Robles to King City and be on your way here, and let's use some of the fundamentals. So the simplest way of navigating and most reliable is simple pilotage. Pilotage is using a technique where you reference what you're seeing outside in terms of geographic features to what you should be seeing based on the map. So if we look really quickly, just at a glance, at this path from Paso Robles to King City, there's a fairly hefty road, one of the only roads, in fact, and it runs northwest, it runs west of Paso Robles, and then runs northwest pretty much straight to where we're going. So that would be the obvious choice. and a great choice. So you'd plan your flight to either fly on the west side or the east side of that highway. That would be a great way of doing it. So now we have something to navigate along to get us to all the way up to our airport. But how are we going to know how we're progressing along there? Some things that jump out are looking for curves in the road. I know that sounds kind of strange, but if you look at these charts for long enough, you start seeing some subtleties in the shapes of the roads that you really can pick out in real life. So a good example is right after the San Ardo private airport near the Lucab intersection, there's a distinctly straight segment of the road, and then there's a little chicane. It bends to the right and it bends to the left. That doesn't happen anywhere else before that point or after that point. So this is a feature that's unique to the road in that one spot. And I know it sounds kind of comical, but something that small can actually help you determine, well, am I here, or am I here, or am I here? And if you see the chicane directly below you, then you know that you're down there. We also have the train line that runs next to it. I have to admit, I find train lines considerably harder to locate than major freeways, unless of course there's a train on the line. That doesn't seem to happen very often. So we've got the railroad primarily, and we have the train line next to us. In terms of geographic features, we're flying in a valley for sure, so we're going to be flying pretty much down the center of this valley. As we depart to the northwest, there'll be a fork in the valley with a lake in it. There's Lake Nacimiento, and then Lake San Antonio. Lake San Antonio is the narrow one that runs to the northwest. That seems to be associated with the valley as well. So a quick look at the relief on the map here allows us to think about this area in 3D. So we're heading out through a valley. There's a branch to the left that leads to the lake. We don't want that one. We want to go on the one on the right, which also has the road on it. So looking for things, for geographic features that can help you but might confuse you is a good idea. It's good to know what those are. And in this case, the valley is an option. Just know that there are actually two valleys, at least by my eye, looking at this for the first time. Now, just so you know, I have not really planned these in advance, these scenarios. I've had a very quick look at the airspace features and the complexity for each scenario to make sure they met my requirements for this presentation, but I haven't gone into detail into planning the flight. Some of that is because I've been busy, but it's also, I'd like you to see the kind of thinking that I'm going through as I'm looking at it for the first time. So we're all seeing this for the first time, and so it gives you an idea of the thoughts that come to mind as we're looking at it. So this is a pretty simple flight, and that was the goal. So we have a road that we can navigate on. I mentioned that pilotage was one way of navigating. Another would be the use of dead reckoning or deduced reckoning. That's where you fly a heading or a known heading or a known course for a certain amount of time, and when you combine that with a known speed over the ground or an estimated speed over the ground, you'll have a time estimate of when you should be at your destination. So without using any GPS or radio navigation or anything like that, we could assume that if we're doing 120 knots from Paso Roble to King City, 120 knots would be 2 miles a minute. And let's see, I'm going to guess how far this is. And again, this is another useful skill to have. I could cheat, in quotes, by using SkyVector to have it tell me the distance. And if I was on the ground with a ruler, I could certainly plot this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my two fingers. If you see the Paso Roble VOR, at our starting airport, we have a compass rose here for the Paso Roble VOR. These are incredibly useful. They're really useful because they're exactly 10 miles in diameter. I'm sorry, in their radius, not diameter, in their radius. So if I literally put my thumb on Paso Roble and my index finger on the edge of the compass rose, out towards Roberts AHP or Camp Roberts, that distance is exactly 10 nautical miles. So I'm going to lock my fingers in to that distance. Now I'm just going to slide my hand, so now my thumb is on Camp Roberts or Roberts AHP. Now wherever my index finger is, right now it's up to just past the MOA. That's 20 miles. So where that little sign is that says MOA and the label that says Victor 25, that would be the 20-mile mark. Now I'm going to slide my hand one more time, keeping my fingers same distance. It takes my index finger right up to about San Lucas. San Lucas is 30 miles. And then San Lucas up to about Coburn would be 40. So I'm guessing it's going to be a little bit under 40 miles. let's see, Denny's saying about 38 miles. Excellent. I think that's a good guess. I think it might come in slightly less, maybe about 37 is going to be my guess. So I promise you I've not looked this up. I was doing it in real time. And the reason I want to teach that technique is because this is incredibly useful when you're in the plane, in the air, and the plane changes, and you don't have a GPS. I've been in that situation many, many times, and it's actually a lot of fun. So you've planned a flight from A to B, and then your passenger gets sick, they change their mind, they say, hey, what's that over there? Or, hey, I just remembered a friend of mine told me there's this really cool airport that way, can we go that way instead? And it's really, really fun to do on-the-fly flight planning. So you can literally be in the airplane with a folded sectional chart. If you don't want to get a ruler out to measure it, there's a real simple way of measuring it. Just use the compass rose, and you can work it out. So let's see how we did. Glad you guys are liking it. Okay, so I'm right-clicking on Paso Roble and I clicked Plan. So that's now
from your channel.
That's now the first entrance in my flight plan from the VOR. To Mesa del Rey. It is 41 nautical miles. I'll be darned. I was slightly off. Denny wins, yes. Okay, so at 2 miles a minute, that's 20.6 minutes. Let's see, if it had been about 4 miles short of that, that would have knocked 2 minutes off. So we were within 10%, which is good. Yes, Lee, thank you. I do have sausage fingers. It was probably that. So the goal of this, of getting an estimation is exactly that. It's to produce an estimate that's reasonable. So we can say reasonably that this is going to take us about 20 minutes. What that means is if you think you see an airport that's Mesa del Rey after 5 minutes, that isn't it. If you see it after 10 minutes, that isn't it. If it's been 20 minutes and you don't see anything that looks like Mesa del Rey, that's an issue. And if it's been 30 minutes, in which case you're now 10 minutes over, 10 minutes times 2 miles a minute is 20 miles, you've probably overshot it by around 20 miles. So this is how dead reckoning can really help you out. I wouldn't necessarily use it as the primary form of navigation, but it's one of the checks and balances. So once I start seeing an airport down there, and a good example might be San Ardo, this little private airport down here. If you're trying to decide if the field that you can see below you is San Ardo or Mesa del Rey, check the time. And that should give you a fairly definitive answer. So dead reckoning is good for actually ruling things out or confirming them when you have a suspicion. Okay, so we've navigated by looking at the roads. We've backed it up by timing. And now we can talk about some basic radio navigation that we could use. As a VFR pilot, you could go through most of your training barely understanding VORs, but they can be very, very useful on these little trips. And again, it's not that we're gonna sit on a radial the entire time and just fly a perfectly straight line. More often than not, I found VORs are really good for intersections, using a radial off of a VOR to find out where you are, as opposed to navigating along it. As it happens, this is coincidental, but Victor 25, which is low en route airway, runs from Paso Robles out to the northwest. You'll notice I'm going to alternate between calling it Paso Robles and Paso Roble. It's because I don't know how to pronounce it. If anybody does, feel free to let me know. Okay, so we could actually navigate along Victor 25, which is the, let me clear off my cheat so I can read. Okay, Victor 25 is the 306 radial off of this VOR. So we could actually just putter along on the 306 radial, look for the highway below us, and that would be a way of navigating along this route. But I'm also interested in the Priest VOR. You'll notice that we could double check our position relative to the Priest VOR. So as we're puttering along our highway here, either using Victor 25 and the nav1 or not at all, it's up to you, we could do a reference check on the Priest VOR. So if we just drew an imaginary line from Priest to San Ardo, you'll notice there's a nice guiding radial right here, the 210. So I'm drawing a line from Priest to the 210 radial. You'll notice the next tick here, these ticks are all 10 degrees. So 210 is here, 220, 230, and here's the 240 radial. The San Ardo Airport is probably just a couple of degrees after the 220 radial. So if you were to dial the 221 radial, or even just make it the 220 radial, that's fine too. Dial the 220 radial into nav1 with the nav radio set to 110.0. That's the priest VOR. It's not that we want to use the VOR to actually go to priest. We're not going to go to the priest VOR at all. We're going to keep on our course here, but when that needle centers, it tells us that we're crossing over the 220 radial, and below us we should see the San Ardo private airport. So we're navigating along a road. We're using dead reckoning to confirm when we're passing, say, the San Ardo airport and approaching Mesa del Rey. We're backing it up potentially with Victor 25, which is the 306 radial, and we're also using the priest VOR to identify points along the way. That would be how I would navigate along this flight. Really, really quickly, I mean, this seems like a fairly simple route. This is what I picked as a fairly direct route. Is anybody seeing any significant geographic references that would be interesting along the way? The only one that stands out to me, and Moon, yep, we're going to talk about the MOAs absolutely in just a sec. I would definitely look for the lakes off the left-hand side. As we depart Paso Robles, we should see Lake San Antonio, long, thin, narrow lake running to the northwest, and Lake Nacimiento running to the west and kind of spidery and more jagged. I would look for those off the left-hand side. If for some reason they end up on our right-hand side, something has definitely gone awry. We may be way off course and heading to the west, and if we see two big lakes off the right, then we know we're going the wrong way. But I would be looking for those off the left-hand side. And by the time we abeam the tip of Lake San Antonio, we should be seeing San Ardo along the way. So I guess that's one more thing I want to add is don't be afraid to combine different geographic features, even though they're not right on top of each other. As I'm along Victor 25, I should see the tip of Lake San Antonio right around the time I'm coming up on San Ardo private airport. And so that can help as well. Okay, let's see. Any suggestions on any other significant geographic features that I might have missed that we could help to navigate along this this flight that we're doing?
User disconnected from your channel.
Okay, Calvin says intersections along the way and the beginning of the rise of the foothills to the northwest of CIC. Yes, yep, that's a really good point. Let me see. Yeah, so there is a significant bit of elevation here. Junipero Sierra Peak is 5,800 feet, and as we're traipsing along Highway 101 here, we should see that off to the left. Let's see if we can measure that distance. That would be about 12 miles to the west, so yes, we should definitely see that. So if we pass the big peak and we don't see Mesa del Rey, and we continue to see very big peaks on the left, it means we've passed Mesa del Rey and something has gone awry. Another way of knowing if we've passed Mesa del Rey is that it sits off of the Big Sur 070 radial. So we might have used Priest to identify San Ardo, then we could swap to using Big Sur. Here's the 060 radial. It's a little hard to read, but there's 0, there's 30, there's 60, and this tick is 70, so a straight line from there to there. That will tell us when we've passed Mesa del Rey. Okay, let's see. A very small population area just northwest of Paso Robles. Yep, that would be Camp Roberts. You might be able to see something there, that's true. Are the runways and the airport icons in the sectional representative of the size and length? They are, not necessarily width-wise, but I believe length-wise they are scale as far as I know. Okay, very good. All right, Calvin said the screen refresh is slow, so I'll avoid doing any major scrolling of the map unless it's absolutely critical. All right, so does anybody have any concerns about how we're going to navigate on this flight from Paso Robles to Mesa del Rey, assuming you only have VOR radios, or maybe not even that. You could be in a Piper Cub with no electrical system, no handheld GPS or anything like that. This should be about a, we said 20-minute flight at 120 knots. Okay, excellent. Yes, the direction of the runways is correct. So the width of the runways is not scale, as far as I know, but the length of them is, and the direction or orientation of the runways is absolutely correct. That's right. So one thing that's a little bit insidious is that Mesa del Rey and San Ardo are both single runway, and they're both northwest oriented. So that's a little bit, that's why you want to make sure you have a way of distinguishing these two visually. Yes, okay. Now that we've worked out how we're going to navigate, we have some airspace considerations. So we have MOAs, which we know we can just plow through merrily. We'd want to find out if the Roberts MOA, if it's going to be active, and whether our route of flight and altitude for our flight is going to take us through the Roberts MOA. So let's do that first. And while we're there, let's also find out about our little friend, restricted area 2504 Alpha and Bravo, because our route of flight could potentially impinge on that. So if it turns out that this is going to be a factor and we don't think we'll be able to get through it, let's make sure we come up with a plan which will keep us out of it. And at a glance, there's a real easy way of knowing whether we're inside or outside of it. Keep Highway 101 off your left. If you do that, it'll be physically impossible to enter restricted area 2504 Alpha and Bravo. So after we take off from Paso Robles, depending on the direction, don't get too wedded to any particular runway. You don't want to plan to depart of a specific runway. You want to make sure you're flexible based on whatever the winds are doing that day. So whichever runway it is that we depart from, let's make sure we go possibly east of the airport, or if we are going to be going west, let's do it fairly quickly to acquire the highway. That'll be the first goal after taking off, will be to acquire Highway 101 and make sure we keep it off our left-hand side, give it a nice wide berth. So keep Camp Roberts and Highway 101. But even so, let's go ahead and learn about restricted area 2504 real quick. So I'm zooming out, and sorry, Calvin, I know this is going to hurt you with the scrolling. I'm on the world VFR chart, so if I keep scrolling, I'm going to end up in Alaska. Hang on a second. So I'm going to swap specifically to the San Francisco sectional chart. So one of those features that they added, which actually works against us. So you notice I was on the world VFR chart before. What we specifically want is the San Francisco sectional chart, because that will have the information that we're looking for.
Just a quick note, Keith, I think you're going to need to be on the LA chart.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it looks like Mesa del Rey is on there, but you're right. It looks like it's on the LA chart. Thank you. Okay, LA sectional it is. Restricted area, restricted airspace is listed on the top. Get my bearings again. Okay, where my mouse is right now, that's PRB. And here is all the airspace descriptions. Let me get the restricted area number. I'll tell you what, we'll work efficiently. Someone tell me what the restricted airspace number was while I get the, thank you. Here we go. Special use airspace on the LA sectional. 2504 Alpha is 2, but not including 6,000 feet, and 2504 Bravo is 6 to 15,000. They have the same lateral area, if memory serves. I looked for that at the time, and it's just one chunk of airspace. It's just stratified in 2 layers vertically. So think of it as one chunk of restricted airspace that goes from the surface all the way up to 15,000 feet. So we're not going over or under this, most likely, unless 2504 Alpha was dead, but 2504 Bravo was active, then we could theoretically go underneath 2504 Bravo. But now, so I guess that is a consideration. If you were needing to go through it, laterally speaking, you could treat it as two separate ones, but for simplicity, I'm going to treat it as one chunk of restricted airspace, just call it 2504, and it goes from the surface to 15,000 feet. So back to Paso Robles. There we go. So that was 2504, and let's have a look at the MOA. The Roberts MOA goes from 500 feet AGL up to, but not including, 15,000 feet. That's a pretty good size MOA. It's intermittent by NOTAM. So there's no specific schedule for it. You just have to check. In fact, I never did check the timing on restricted area either. Okay, so restricted area 2504 Alpha and Bravo is from 600 to 2400. So there's only 6 hours in the day when it's not active. So 2504 is pretty active. Roberts, not so much. Okay, so back to our chart. Let's see. So that's about the only airspace that really pertains to us. If we're on the ground at Paso Robles, what type of airspace are we in? Three votes for Delta, 2 votes for Echo. Another vote for Delta. Very interesting. If anybody can't see the chart, feel free to if the screen is lagging, feel free to pull up Sky Vector and go to Paso Robles. We're on the ground at Paso Robles, at the airport, on the surface. Okay, so the opinion is divided between Delta and Echo. There's a good number of people saying Delta and a few more people saying Echo. Correct. So at the end of the first workshop, we went through the different altitudes for Class E airspace. There are a couple of different exceptions. So Class Echo generally begins at 1,200 feet. And then there are exceptions. There's one exception that brings Echo down to 700. There's an exception that brings it down to the surface. And there's an exception that makes it start at some random high altitude. This is one of those cases where we have Echo all the way down to the surface, the magenta line here. Users of the first workshop will also remember that we don't care. I tried to impress on people that the distinction between Echo and Golf, practically speaking, as a VFR pilot, should not matter a great deal. And so don't get too hung up on whether this is Echo or Golf to the surface. It was kind of a trick question. We don't really care whether it's Echo or Golf. What we really care about is whether it's airspace where we need to talk to someone or airspace where we don't need to talk to someone. That's probably a good way of approaching it. And so it's purple. We don't need to talk to anyone. It's not Bravo. It's not Charlie. It's not Delta. Is it Echo or Golf? At a glance, you may not actually know the answer, to be honest. Unless you're a chart aficionado, you may not be 100% sure of what this dashed magenta line means, and that's not the end of the world. You may not remember that whether it's 700 or 1200 or the surface where it starts. As long as you know that it's not Delta or Charlie or Bravo, that's a start. So yes, this, as it happens, is Echo all the way down to the ground. If the Echo had started at 700 feet and it was actually Golf at the surface, it doesn't really affect us a great deal. We don't need to talk to anyone either way in terms of ATC. It affects our weather minimums, but again, from the first workshop, that shouldn't matter. You shouldn't really be getting into a case where you need the luxury that Class Golf affords over Class Echo. You're very close to getting yourself killed if you need that, at least in my opinion, if you need that, that extra cushion. Okay, so we're going to be departing from a Class Echo airport, non-towered, and let's just move the mouse and see if there's any other changes in that. Let's say we're going to go at 4,500 feet. I'll tell you what, I'm going to pick a slightly, and take a slightly different track for just a sec. Okay, so Pass Robles is about 839 feet off the ground here. That's what 839 means. Yeah, we'll be, let's see, there's a couple of questions going. Is blue Class Delta? Yes. Yeah, we'll be looking at let me pull up since the question's been asked. Salinas is an example of a Class Delta airport right here where I'm moving my mouse. So it looks a little bit like the Class Echo, but it's blue, not purple, and it has an altitude depicted. That's how you can tell the delta very, very quickly. So don't get too hung up on the color. Look for the little square box, and that's an instant giveaway of a delta. Oh, I see the fuzzy lines. Gotcha. Right. These blue lines depict the restricted area, and these blue zippers are one of those really annoying cases that raise the surface of Class E airspace from the default of 1,200. It's raising it all the way up to 5,000 feet. So if you're below 5,000 feet, you're actually in Class Gulf airspace in anywhere in this blue zippered area. Again, a real pain. It complicates the chart a whole bunch, and it really doesn't mean much as a VFR pilot. Okay, so let's talk about what altitude we can go at on this flight, and then don't worry, I'm gonna speed things up a little bit after this. I'm watching the time. So what altitude might we go at? The easy answers, which will be 6,500, 4,500, 3,000. Those are the no-brainers. Here's an interesting one. Could we go at 3,500 feet? Could we fly at 3,500 feet NSL legally out of Paso Robles, heading along the highway here up to, let's say, about Victor 25, where my mouse is right there? If we chose to fly that at 3,500 feet northwest bound along the highway, would we be legal? Okay. Okay, so we're getting a little bit of a mix. Yep, so people it's slowly jogging people's memory that when you're heading west, you go at an even number of 1,000 feet plus 500. When you're going east, it would be an odd number plus 500. But we are definitely heading west, so by the letter of the law, that implies we should be at an even altitude. So 3,500 initially is not sounding legal, right? Except when you take into account that it only applies when you're flying over 3,000 feet AGL. AGL. Paso Robles is 800 feet high. That's why I looked very carefully. And that color associated with Paso Robles, this kind of greenish, continues all the way up here. So we can assume that the ground level is all around 800 feet MSL, all the way up to at least where it says Victor 25 here, possibly even more. While San Ardo itself is at 441 feet MSL. So the odd-even rules only kick in if you're at 3,000 AGL or above. So do not be shy about using 3,500 feet if it's operationally advantageous to you. So if there's a cloud that's kind of in the way at 4,500 feet, go ahead and use 3,500 feet for a while because you're below 3,000 feet AGL. Those rules only kick in when you hit 3,000 feet AGL, not MSL. So it's perfectly legal to be 3,000, 3,100, 3,200, 3,300, 34, 35, etc. because the ground is actually 800 feet. So it's only once you're above 3,839 feet that those rules mean anything. That's not just a little technicality that's where you're being fancy to use those rules. It can be very helpful sometimes. So when the terrain is between the terrain and the weather, you may be getting into a tough spot to use those legal altitudes in quotes. Don't forget that the legal altitudes don't apply until you're 3000 AGL. Okay, very good. All right, so we have our altitude planned. We might go at 3,000, 4,500. Doesn't really matter that much, to be honest. If anyone's passionate about why you would fly at, say, 3,000 or 4,500 or 3,500 for the first half, I am not. I usually don't plan it to such a specific altitude. You know, usually I'm deciding if I'm going to be at 12.5, 10.5, 8.5, or down low. That's how I usually stratify it. I don't get too concerned whether it's going to be 3,000 or 4,500. Winds aloft will probably maybe change that a little bit, so I'll look at what the winds are. If they're howling out of the northwest and it's, say, relatively calm down at the surface, and then it just gets worse and worse the higher you go, I'll probably take the lowest altitude I'm comfortable with then with the terrain. But if it's a nice day and not very windy, I'll probably go higher to give me better visibility, better options if my engine goes out, those sorts of things. So it's a little bit of a blend of what's different factors. Let's see, Calvin says, so if I'm crossing a mountain range at 9,000 feet, the rule does not apply. Correct, yeah, the rule only applies where you're 3,000 feet AGL or more. Take an extreme example. Let me go to the Sierras real quick. Here we are looking at the Sierras. If you're going to go from Lone Pine to Visalia, it's not up until you're around 15 or 16,000 feet that you're that the east-west altitudes are going to apply. And in some cases your plane literally might not be able to get that high. So if you want to go at 13.5 or 15.5, it might be actually okay to be going westbound at that altitude, depending on what the terrain is. Okay, apologize for the scrolling. All right, let's get into the comms. So let's see, we've talked about how we're going to navigate. We know how long it's going to take. Let's see, we've considered our airspace. Oh no, sorry, we haven't finished considering our airspace. We know we're going to be in echo as we take off. We're going to be in echo for the rest, and we know we're in echo by default because there's nothing else around. So when anyone says, once you're en route and your instructor looks at you and says, what airspace are we in? If you just blurt out echo, you're going to be right 99% of the time. You're in echo by default unless you're low enough to be in the Gulf, in which case you can say I'm in echo or Gulf, and you'd be definitely right. So what we're really looking for, what's really important, is whether we're going to knock into any other airspace of any significance. And I do not see any. We don't have any Delta, we don't have any Charlie, we don't have any Bravo. This is why I picked this flight. This is a simple flight airspace-wise, just with a small discussion about the military complex over here. Okay, so no airspace of any consequence. So the question is, do we need to talk to ATC on this flight from Paso Robles to King City? Does anybody feel like we do not have to talk to ATC? Lots of people feel like we don't have to talk to ATC, and you'd be correct. We do not have to talk to ATC. So this could be a very relaxing flight. So we're not actually legally obliged to talk to anybody, period, on this flight. We could leave the radio off if we like. Not very smart, but you can leave the radio off in your airplane. It's a good way to annoy the people who are in the traffic pattern at Paso Robles, but it's legal. But if you do have a radio, I'd suggest tuning it to 123.0. You get the weather on 120.125 beforehand, or set your altimeter to the field elevation. So set your altimeter to 839, and I guarantee you won't be very far off what the altimeter setting is. And look at the windsock to see what the winds are doing. That's a fine way of getting the weather. Or you can tune it in on the radio and get the weather. And then you swap over to 123.0, and that's the CTAF, the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency. That's the frequency that everyone will be using to announce their intentions. Contacting Oakland Center for NOA status. I would do that in the air. The MOA actually doesn't bother us. For this flight, we truly don't care whether the Hunter MOA or the Roberts MOA are hot, because we can easily avoid it without it really without it raining on our parade. If you do want to find out the status of it, though, the two methods would be during the pre-flight briefing. Go ahead and speak to a briefer and ask them what's the status of the Roberts MOA, and they will tell you whether it's hot or not. You can also do it airborne. Yes, you would talk to, let's see, we'd have to scroll up to the top and find out who the controlling agency for the Roberts MOA is. I suspect you're right. It's either going to be LA Center or Oakland Center, one of the two. And ask them, hey, is the Roberts MOA hot? Okay, yep, people are saying it was Oakland Center. Very good. And so, yes, you could find out the status of the airspace that way. Okay, so from a comms perspective, this is going to be, first we'd make a decision prior to the flight, I would suggest, of whether we're going to utilize flight following for this flight or not. And it wouldn't be a bad idea, because you'll notice, just as it was a natural choice for us to pick Highway 101, if there are other people coming from Northern California to Southern California, not just Mesa del Rey to Paso Robles, but anywhere in this area down to here, do we really think we're the only people who have the genius plan of flying along Highway 101? Probably not. This is likely to be a smart choice for people to fly along, because all this other stuff out here, just looking at it right now, not a whole lot of fun if your engine quits. No major roads, no major towns, no airports, and potentially inhospitable terrain. So the safe bet for sure, from an engine out perspective, would be to use the highway. I'm with you, Denny. On a flight like this, I would get flight following almost certainly, because we're pushing ourselves into a corridor. This doesn't look like a corridor at a glance, but practically speaking, if there's any VFR traffic around here, it's probably going to be flying along this corridor. So so it would be a good idea to get flight following. It's also a 20-minute flight, so there's plenty of time. Getting flight following will probably take you 15 to 20 seconds. So I would recommend it. But let's talk about the bare bones version. In fact, on this flight, let's not do it. We're not going to get flight following on this flight, but the next one we're going to do, which is out of Mesa del Rey for leg 2, we will certainly get flight following for that one. How's that? But so the bare minimum of communications, this is a nice icebreaker flight. I know we've done a lot of flight planning, looking at the MOAs and things like that, but practically speaking, this is actually fairly simple. We're going to keep Highway 101 off the left-hand side. We're going to truck along. We're going to use dead reckoning to time it. We're going to look for the priest radials. We're going to look for the lakes off the left, all that good stuff, to identify San Ardo, and those will probably be my 2 checkpoints. I would use San Ardo, and then I'd look for Mesa del Rey coming up next, with Calvin's very good suggestion of looking for the big mountains over on the west there. What is a good rule to switch to 122.9? What's 122.9? Ah, okay. I'd say 10 miles out or so. You want to be monitoring it by ideally no less than 10 miles out. Yep, Chris chimed in with an answer too. Okay, so we're taking off. Opinions divided on whether you should announce your taxiing or not. Taxiing is done at about 5 to 10 knots. You don't suddenly have a head-on collision that is fatal during taxiing. It certainly doesn't happen suddenly. So I personally never announce that I'm taxiing, just to reduce the congestion, because at a busy airport, I feel like it adds no value. So I do not announce that I'm taxiing, because it's not particularly useful. Yeah, correct. Crossing a runway is a slightly different matter. I would announce that I'm crossing the runway, because I'm using an active runway potentially, or entering an active runway. But for taxiing, I don't. My first radio call that I would make, other than crossing a runway, would be when I'm about to depart. So we taxi to the run-up area, the hold short area. We conduct our run-up. We are all set to go. Check finals clear. Lights, camera, action. So landing light, strobes, whatever lighting is appropriate for your airplane. Transponder to altitude, and then off you go. So we make the call, Paso Robles traffic, Cessna. Again, opinion is slightly divided on this one. I believe the AIM recommends you use the full call sign. let's just go with that. I'm not going to disagree with the aim in a seminar. So pass roadways traffic, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, taking off runway, oh geez, I haven't looked at the runways, I apologize. Let's say 3-1 if it's a straight out departure to the northwest there. That looks close-ish. So pass roadways traffic, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, taking off runway 31, straight out departure, past the roadways. The question was, does this fly at night? I'm assuming, Calvin, you're asking about would I mention that I'm taxiing at night? No, I still wouldn't mention that I'm taxiing at night. Actually, a plane is easier to see at night in some ways than it is during the day, because I will use my strobes when I'm taxiing at night, and it's virtually impossible to miss. Oh, good. I'm glad that that runway was 3-1. I honestly hadn't looked that up, but I'm told it is 3-1. Okay, so you'll notice we mentioned the name of the airport. This is important. So name of the airport, what we were doing, which is taking off runway 31. Please don't say you're taking off on the active or taking the active. The active doesn't mean anything to anybody. So be specific about the runway that you're using. Yeah, I never say taking the, yeah. Where are you taking it? That's a good question. So be specific about which runway you're using every time. So we're taking off runway 31, straight out departure, past the roadways. So which runway are we going to be taking off from? The fact that we're taking off, the fact that we're doing a straight out departure is useful for people to know. And here's why that's useful to know. If I'm in a Piper coming from the southeast and I'm going to be landing here, I care whether the plane that's taking off on runway 31 is going to be making left close traffic, or a left downwind departure, or a left 270, or a right 270, or a right downwind departure, or a straight out, or a left crosswind, or a right crosswind. All of those things are important for me to know as I'm approaching the field. So you're really helping everybody else around you when you're specific about what you're doing in the smallest number of words. So we're not doing a straight-out departure and, hey, we're going to be cruising over to San Ardo and then we're going to be passing Lake San Jacinto. You know, you're not explaining to everyone on the radio your entire route of flight, but you do want to indicate the direction of flight, because that will assist them in knowing where to be looking for you and if you're going to be a factor. So the minute you say straight-out departure, the Piper that's down here southeast that's about to make his or her radio call to say that they'll be landing at Paso Robles breathes a sigh of relief and says, okay, I no longer care about that airplane because he's going to be making a straight out departure. And yes, on to the last point. I was going to get to that. You're right. You'll notice that we are very specific about the phraseology there. Paso Robles traffic. The word traffic is important there. Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo taking off runway 31, straight out departure, Paso Robles. We include the name of the airport both at the beginning and the end of the transmission. This is not something that we do at towered airports, but it is very important to do at non-towered airports, and this is something which a lot of pilots don't do. They do it during their training and then they let it slide. And I fly into a lot of non-towered airports in many parts of the country, and a huge percentage of pilots are not doing that, and it gets a little bit frustrating. The reason it's frustrating is that 123.0 is not uniquely owned by the Paso Robles Airport. There are other airports around. You know, I'm actually not going to spend the time, because we're a little behind, I'm not going to spend the time finding them, but when you're up at altitude, you will catch portions of transmissions that often step on each other. There'll be a lot more congestion on the CTAFs typically than at a towered airport because they are a shared resource. So you might miss the first third of someone's transmission, the first half, could be 3/4 of the transmission, but you might hear runway 31, and that's it. Well, what if the airport you're going into has a runway 31? Or the airport number was kind of scratchy and you're not sure. So you're not sure if you want to say again, because do you really want everyone around you to have to repeat the transmission that they made in the last 5 seconds? You know, you could just end up with a squeal of planes trying to respond. So I know it sounds like a big disaster, but it really can be frustrating if you have no idea if the call you just heard was for the airport that you care about. So yes, it is a good idea, and the AIM does support this, to use the airport name both at the beginning and the end. It is very good practice. Okay, so 2 questions here. What about at a towered field? You don't know for sure which is the active. There is not a great excuse for not knowing the active runway at a towered airport in real life, because you will need to tune the ATIS prior to taxi, and the ATIS will state the runways that are in use. And if you, let's say there are multiple active runways, Caldwell, my home airport, or my nearest class Delta is a good example, they'll sometimes be using 22 and 28. In that case, you can tell them which runway you'd like, or if you don't care, just say you're ready for taxi for closed traffic. Saying to the active is not adding any information. Of course you're looking to taxi to a runway. If you're looking to taxi to something other than a runway, you would be saying that. So I've done that many times. Caldwell Tower, Lancer 360 Juliet Hotels at the airbound FBO for taxi to Paragon. Paragon is the name of a maintenance facility. But if I say that I'm ready for, I'd like to taxi for closed traffic, obviously I'm not going to taxi to the fueling pumps for closed traffic. So the words to the active are practically meaningless. I don't want to be harsh, but they actually don't mean anything. So no, I don't think there's a need to do it at a towered field. And let's see, some airports are known by different names. Marshall County is known as Holly Springs, name of the city. Need to listen for either name at such airports. Gavin, that's absolutely spot on. Jim's saying that ATIS reported on the active can disagree with the controls active. That's correct, yes. The ATIS that's generated by the sim is almost purely based on winds, and if there's so much as a 3-knot breeze, they'll change it over to a runway which in the real world would never be used until it's literally blowing a gale. And so you do not need to, you can't necessarily trust the ATIS that you're getting for now on the sim. Just simply say that you're ready for taxi, and you're taxi for either closed traffic or a northwest departure, whatever it is. And again, they'll tell you where to taxi. Should I use the model of aircraft or only the N number? Okay, so let's talk about call signs. Valid forms of the call sign. So let's assume we're in 123 Alpha Bravo. That's our N number is N123 Alpha Bravo, and we're in a Cessna Skyhawk. Here are the forms of call sign that are valid for that aircraft. November 123 Alpha Bravo is valid. November 3 Alpha Bravo is valid after the controller has shortened the call sign once in communications with you. So when you first initiate communication with a air traffic controller, you would say Salinas Tower Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, or Salinas Tower November 123 Alpha Bravo, or Salinas Tower Skyhawk 123 Alpha Bravo. So you can use the N number, you can use the manufacturer, or you can use the model. And Chris is correct. Cessna can be anything from a Cessna Citation to a Cessna 172. People who fly Citations like to tell everyone they're in Citation, so they'll probably say Citation. I don't know of any Citation pilots who would just say Cessna. Also, they're probably not flying VFR. They're probably IFR and they have a strip. But all that aside, I agree. I'd use the model number. I'd use the model name for anything like a Piper. I'd probably go with the model. The Cessna, I'd use a model. The Beech, I'd use a model, because they're a very popular manufacturer with lots of different models. If you're in a relatively rare manufacturer's airplane that only has, say, the one model, then it's go either way. It doesn't really matter too much. So you can use make or model or just November. But here's what we don't want to do. Salinas Tower, Cessna Skyhawk, November 123 Alpha Bravo. So we've hit them with a triple whammy. We did November and we did the make and model. It makes the controllers twitch slightly and start sacrificing woodland creatures up in the tower. That's what I do. We're not allowed to strangle pilots, so instead I take it out on wildlife. So if you want to save a deer or a squirrel, try not to use all three when you call us. So no, you don't want to say all three. Pick one and use it. So again, Skyhawk 123 Alpha Bravo, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, or November 123 Alpha Bravo, as well as the shortened forms of those. And the shortened is the last three significant bits and pieces. So before it was November 123 Alpha Bravo, the last three parts of that are just 3 Alpha Bravo. So now once it's shortened, we can go with November 3 Alpha Bravo, Skyhawk 3 Alpha Bravo, or Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo. Those are the only forms of that call sign. Anything else that you've made up is wrong. Okie dokie, so we've made our radio call and we are listening for other traffic. We're using some due diligence, by the way. Before we take off, it's not just it's not good enough to simply just make the call and go. Making a call doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's heard you, doesn't mean that they're on the right frequency, it doesn't mean that they were listening, it doesn't mean that they had their radio on. So making the call is great, but you need to be looking out the window first and foremost. So never taxi onto the runway without having a good look to make sure final's clear. And hopefully you've been listening as you've been taxiing. So minimize the chat that you're having with your co-pilot about what you're going to have for lunch at Mesa Del Rey. Keep it fairly quiet and to necessary conversation only, and really listen to the radio. Get a feel for what's going on. Find out if the pattern's busy. Find out if there's someone who's in the pattern who's struggling. If they've got a weak radio, or if they just suck on the radio. I mean, it's I'm trying to think of a more graceful way of putting it, but there is some pretty dodgy stuff that goes on at non-towered airports, and to the extent that you can maintain a very high level of situational awareness, it'll be the very safest thing you can do. And please do not arrive at the runway completely unprepared, having not listened to a word that's been going on, and say, any traffic in the pattern for Paso Robles, please advise. It's the single worst thing you can do. If anybody says that here, I'm sorry, but I violently disagree with that practice, and so do most publications now. AOPA is saying the same thing. AIM, the Aeronautical Information Manual, also says don't do it. It doesn't scale. It shows that you haven't been paying attention. The only time I would say there is an excuse for doing it might be at my home airport. I personally don't do it, but I understand why people do it when the final is obstructed. So if you cannot really see the short final very well because of trees, because of trees or some other obstruction, then it's, when push comes to shove, it can be safer to say, hey, is anybody on final? But listening goes a long way. So if you had been listening while you were taxiing, you may have heard that there was a person who called the crosswind turn, the downwind turn, and the base turn. So by the time you arrive, without even looking up, you have a good idea that someone is on base to final. You could either look up and just see them coming, or you could use your powers of deduction from the last 3 or 4 radio calls that they made and know that they're coming. So always maintain situational awareness and try and build a picture of what's going on in the pattern. If there are 5 people in the pattern, it's going to be busy. There really isn't time for people to arrive at the runway and say, hey, anybody in the traffic at Robles, because you don't want all 5 people who are in the pattern to transmit at the same time. So yes, listening is very important. And yes, check both directions. So just because you've decided to take off on a particular runway, it doesn't mean that there's someone who isn't coming the other way, even if it's blowing fairly hard. People make some interesting decisions sometimes about the runway they're going to use. But particularly when it's only a light wind, if it's a 5-knot wind, there may be operational advantages to someone using a different runway. They might land with a 5-knot tailwind for about 7 different reasons I could list if we had time. So yes, definitely check both ways, not just final for the runway you're about to use, but also the other way. Okie dokie. So we're en route. We've taken off. We've left the traffic pattern. We're looking really, really hard as we depart on our straight out for people who are entering the traffic pattern. We're listening, and we're looking out the window for people who might be trying to enter the traffic pattern. I have to be honest. I've nearly had 3 mid-airs, and I'm sorry, I've nearly had 4 mid-airs in my 500 hours. 3 of them were at non-towered airports while I was entering the traffic pattern. And I hold some of the responsibility for those as much as the other pilot. It is not the safest place to be honest, is non-towered airports. And it really took me looking through some logs, some web-based logs of some of my flights, where I'm like, boy, there's this emerging pattern where I keep scaring myself at these non-towered airports. And when I think back to what I was doing, if I'm really honest with myself about what I was doing, I was too busy, heads down, looking up some information about the airport for one reason or another. Sometimes it's just a mistake that I've made in briefing too late, or I've been really, really busy on that flight and haven't been able to brief properly, or it's a diversion. That's happened once on a diversion too, where I had a fuel issue and needed to divert. Whatever the reason is, you want to arrive at a traffic pattern really prepared and have all your information squared away and not be heads down, because while your head's down, if someone else is arriving and their head's down, then boom, that's how those things happen. And I believe there are statistics I have read in a number of places now that most mid-airs happen at non-towered airports, or at least within the vicinity of an airport, with airplanes that are maneuvering for either takeoff or landing at an airport. So it's the most dangerous phase of flight, is the arrival, probably closely followed by the departure. So be on your game, looking for traffic. Don't relax too early, and also don't leave the frequency too early. Make sure you're truly out of the traffic pattern and you've got a good idea that no one else is really around. I'll give you a very practical example. If we've just taken off of 3-1, we're heading northwestbound, and we're thinking about calling Oakland Center for that flight following, and you suddenly hear Paso Robles traffic, Piper 456, Bravo Charlie, over Camp Roberts, inbound for closed traffic, or inbound for a left downwind runway 31 Paso Robles. Well, now I'm probably not going to swap over to Oakland Center. I'm going to stay on the frequency, and I'm going to make sure that I acquire that target. So we're here, where my mouse is. The guy has just reported over Camp Roberts, heading for Paso Robles. This would be a terrible time to lose communication with that guy. You might not actually say anything, or you may reiterate your position, because he may not have heard your takeoff roll. Your takeoff roll could have been 2.5 minutes ago, and at that point he may have been talking, ironically, with Oakland Center, or he may have been talking to nobody at all. You might just make another call and say, Paso Robles traffic, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo is 2 miles northwest of the field on the departure leg heading northwest, Paso Robles. And you might actually address the pilot, say, heading northwest, looking for the inbound over Camp Roberts. So you're subtly letting that pilot know you've heard him and you're looking for him, and in your mind, he's a factor. So there are subtleties in that communication which I think are very effective. So once you've spotted the target or determined it's no factor, then you can consider making the switch over to Oakland Center. Question, how often should a position report be made and or expected? If you're staying in the traffic pattern, the upwind, crosswind, I'm sorry, maybe not necessarily the upwind. I think opinion's divided on the upwind. If I'm leaving the area, I'll probably say the upwind. But if I'm remaining in the pattern, most likely I'll call the crosswind, because I reach crosswind altitude. The crosswind turned fairly quickly in my airplane. So I'd call the takeoff, the crosswind, the downwind, the base, the final, and then clear. That's for traffic pattern operations. If I'm leaving the area, I'd simply announce that I'm taking off, and then one more call on the departure leg when I'm about to leave the frequency. Those are the calls I'd be making on the departure. Would you say your altitude when you made that second CTAF advisory call? Yes, absolutely. Again, you're trying to paint a picture for other pilots as well, and that your altitude is incredibly relevant. I wouldn't necessarily make it if I had heard nobody in the area. So if it's just a ghost town, I'd just simply sound the departure leg, heading northwest, something like that. It's only if I really suspect that there's value that I'd probably add the altitude. So if that guy was over Camp Roberts, I'm definitely going to state my altitude there, so that I'm doing him the favor of allowing him to paint a picture of where I am as well. So it kind of goes both ways. You're feeding information into the system that will help other pilots as efficiently as possible. On the arrival side, typical calls are at 10 miles, 5 miles, and then for the pattern entries, wherever you are on the pattern. So I'd call probably 10 miles out, then I'd call 5 out, and then I would report entering my left downwind on the 45, then the base, then the final, etc., then clear with runway. Okay, well, I am a little concerned about the time, so I'm going to need to either speed up, we'll see how things go with the other scenarios, or I will face the possibility that we will have to break it up and do an extra workshop, maybe say in a week from now. Either way. Yeah, there's no information so far that I'd want to take out. This is important, somewhat critical information. In fact, there is a lot to go through. So if we need to split it up, we shall. We'll see how it goes. But I will go as quick as I can. Alrighty, so any other questions about the communications or procedure associated with departing this this area so far? We haven't touched the en route or the arrival yet, but before I move on to that, are there any burning questions about the Paso Robles area, essentially? All right, very good. Okay, so we said we wouldn't be doing flight following, so we might just leave the CTAF for Paso Robles in for a while, and then about halfway, or we might you could switch the radio off. We might monitor Oakland Center, so without actually checking in with them, we might simply tune them in and find out what other stuff is going on in the area. So even though you don't have flight following, it's not a terrible idea to listen into Oakland Center and find out if there's anything significant going on. It could be that you're heading west at, say, 4,500 feet. You're over the highway and you hear Oakland Center pointing out to, say, a Learjet who's descending into Paso Robles. Lear 123 Alpha Bravo, traffic, let's see, 12 o'clock, 4 miles, northwest bound, altitude indicates 4,500, type unknown. That's interesting. Well, I'm at 4,500. I'm northwest bound. The controller definitely doesn't know what type of aircraft I am because I'm squawking VFR and he has no clue. He just sees a VFR target at 4,500. That may well be me. So without even talking to the controller, I have a suspicion that there is a Learjet at my 12 o'clock, southeast bound, that's a factor within a couple of thousand feet above or below me. Because if that Learjet was at 16,000 feet, he's not going to point me out being at 4,500 feet. So I've found it actually very beneficial, especially in the Northeast here. Sometimes the controller, quite honestly, is speaking so quickly and continuously, there isn't time for me to check in and receive flight following from the person. I'll actually make the conscious decision not to talk to them if they're so crazily busy with an arrival flow into, say, Teterboro or Morristown or Caldwell here in the Northeast. I won't put that extra workload on them, but I will listen, and every now and then I'll hear myself getting pointed out to a plane, and it's kind of like getting a form of flight following, believe it or not, without having to make any calls on the radio and clog up the frequency. Yes, Gavin, that's a good point. I had not thought of that. Gavin said, idea to have the frequency tuned just in case of an emergency, saves the time to locate and tune. Excellent point. And Frank, that is correct. I had completely forgotten to mention it, and it is true. If you only have the one radio on your board, then monitoring 121.5 is suggested by the regs. I think it might only be in the AIM. It may not be in an FAR, a regulation, but I believe it is in the AIM. It also speaks to Gavin's point about the emergency. So if you're on 121.5 and another pilot is in distress, you will be able to hear that pilot's calls. If you end up in a point where you're in distress, you can call on 121.5 and the nearby, all the controllers will be monitoring that frequency. So that's a quick way to reach ATC if need be. Denny asked a great question, which is how do you know which center you should be talking to? So let's see. In this case, we can kind of cheat, I think, because we can look up who the controlling agency is for the Roberts MOA or the Hunter MOA. So let's go get it from there. You know what? That's going to take too long. Sorry about that. By the time I get the LA one. So we could look up the Oakland Center frequency for the MOAs over on the Los Angeles or San Francisco sectional chart. That would work. We could find out who the controller is for the Paso Robles Airport. Whenever you see echo airspace down to the surface, there's a very good reason that that's being done because of instrument approaches at that airport. So we could find out who the air traffic controller is for Paso Robles. Here's how we do that. There it is. For Paso Robles approach and departure services provided by Oakland Center on 128.7 on the Priest RCAG. So at the Priest VOR, there is a transmitter right on the top of the mountain on 128.7 that allows the people in Oakland, a couple of 100 miles away, to talk to you. So you could call Oakland Center on 128.7. Yep, the AFD helps. If you have a GPS, you can dial in Paso Robles and go to the frequency tab, and it should show you the local overlying approach control. There is no approach control at Paso Robles. It's not in a TRACON. It's not in TRACON airspace. It's in Oakland Center's airspace in this case. So that's how those are different ways you can get that frequency. Let's see. Wouldn't the squawk code you're given by the control for flight following help them even if you didn't get much, if any, assistance? Help them even if you didn't get much? Yes, if controllers love knowing more about the planes that are in their airspace, as far as I know. That's to the best of my knowledge. So if you're going to be traipsing up and down that corridor, and it's a relatively busy corridor, then yes, it helps them out if they know a little bit more about where you are, what you're doing, etc. So yes, you could have flight following, and again, as it turns out, there aren't too many flights where you don't want to have flight following, but for the simplicity, because we're going to be covering flight following on other flights, I didn't do it for this one. But yes, if you're already talking to ATC and they've already radar identified you, it actually makes things easier for just about everybody. Okay, so traipsing along Highway 101, and yes, from San Ardo to King City, looks like it's about, I'm just leaning over. Let's see if I can get this more accurate this time. Boom, boom. Probably about 13 miles. There we go. Let's see how we do. 16. Dope. Okay, so yes, you could start listening to King City, and then when you're 10 miles out or so, we'd start making the call. So either King City traffic or Mesa Del Rey. I'm almost sure that people call it King City in real life. So King City traffic, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, 10 miles southeast, inbound for landing. And if you've already looked at the runway number, planning for runway, what is that, 28 potentially? 28 or 29 or 30. And you could make a straight in potentially. I don't recommend it, but you could plan to make a straight in if it was operationally advantageous, or if you're very lazy. Or you could say we'll report on the left or right downwind. Let's see, it is left downwind. If there was right traffic, it would be made available in the airport information right here. It would say RP31 or RP30. Thanks, Reese. So Reese says it's 29. So yep, you could say would report on the left downwind runway 29. Now that sounds inconvenient, and it actually is inconvenient, but it is one of the better things to do, particularly if it's busy. I mean, if it's absolutely dead, you don't hear a single thing, you don't see a single plane out there, then certainly use your judgment and go ahead and make the straight in if that works for you. So make the calls 10 miles out, 5 miles out, 2 mile final, and then maybe short final. And if you don't hear a soul, then no harm, no foul. But if this has a bunch of airplanes, and I believe this has a lot of flight training here. There's aerobatic training. I'm thinking this might be a fairly busy airport. The straight in really can make things difficult for sequencing. It makes life difficult for everybody in the traffic pattern as they try and work out just where you are and if this is all going to work out. So even though we're arriving from over here, we might have to plan to maneuver west of the field where my mouse is, and then honk a pretty good right turn to enter the left downwind on the 45. This will give you a view of the traffic pattern. Everyone will know exactly where you are when you say that you're entering on the 45, and they can make adjustments and you can make adjustments to fit into the traffic pattern. Then we'd call on the left downwind, left base, turning final for 29, and then once clear of the active. And that's all on 122.9. So in fact, that actually takes us to the end of that of the first scenario. Any questions on the arrival at Mesa Del Rey in terms of either airspace or the pattern or the radio calls? Denny's asking, would you enter at midfield on the 45? Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Midfield on the 45, correct. When you said 45 right, I thought you meant right traffic. I'm like, no, not right traffic. But yes, that's correct. Enter at the midfield on the 45. That is the recommended entry. A crosswind entry, not so much. If you're arriving from the northeast, I'd say a crosswind entry might be advantageous, but I don't see a ton of advantage to trying to do it from where we are. I've used I've used straights at certain airports if it's absolutely dead, and there's an advantage to doing it. I've used crosswinds, and I have entered on downwinds on the 45. Those are generally the only ones that I've used. Alrighty. Right, let's hop right into our scenario 1B. And we'll actually move. As I said, we're going to go very, very, very deep on that. We're not going to be anywhere near as deep on the other scenarios. It'll be more about the comms at this point. Calvin's asking, on controlled fields, do you come across local good Samaritans offer help like a quasi-flight service station? No, I don't. It's not really legal for anyone other than a qualified Unicom operator to offer advisories like that. And no, I have not seen any cases where I've seen people attempting to help with sort of pretending to be a flight service station. Most likely they would get in the way. Again, listening goes a long way. So if you're listening from 10 or 15 miles out, you will soon establish that there's either nobody there. I shouldn't say establish with certainty, but you can get a sense for if there's absolutely nobody there, if there's one girl in the traffic pattern, or if there are 7 people in the traffic pattern. If they're making their calls, you'll build a picture pretty quickly of what's going on. And again, if there are 7 people in the pattern, brevity is definitely the best course of action. Have the call ready to go. Honestly, I would skip the call sign, because what are the chances that 7 people are going to remember 6 other people's call signs? So this is honestly one of the places where I use judgment, and I don't use my call sign when I fly at non-towered airports. So I would just say Lancer. That's about it. Now I'd possibly say Skyhawk, or if there are a ton of Skyhawks and you have a special color, if you're in a red Skyhawk, I might say red Skyhawk or red and white Skyhawk, something like that. But you want to be as quick as you can on those calls. Just say enough so that people know where you are and what your plan is. In fact, to that point, really, really quickly, one of the best things that you can do, let's say we were entering the traffic pattern, and there were 3 people in the pattern. Let's say we were just about on the 45 here. I'm going to zoom in if I can. Nope, that's as much as we can zoom. So we are here over this 296-foot AGL tower, which is 821 feet MSL. Good to know, by the way, that that's what that symbol means, especially when it's possibly conflicting with the pattern entry. So we're shooting to be about 1,000 feet AGL, which, remember, Mesa del Rey is 374 feet. So you'll want to be entering at the pattern altitude should be around 1,400 feet, would be my guess, unless it's published otherwise in the AFD. So we're honking along at 1,000 feet AGL, so 1,400 feet MSL. We're planning to enter on the downwind on the 45. So as I'm moving my mouse, that's literally the kind of path that we'd be on. And throughout the maneuvering, we've heard someone taking off. We know that there was someone on the crosswind, and let's say we knew there was someone downwind about to turn base. So as we are entering on the 45, the person who's downwind about to turn base is certainly going to be ahead of us. The question is whether the person who was upwind or crosswind at the time, we want to try and acquire them visually as soon as humanly possible and work out real quick if we're going to beat them or if we're going to fall in behind them. If it's close, then you really have to use your judgment as to whether you think you're going to be ahead of them. You certainly don't want to cut them off. That's when you want to let the person know, whether you see them or not. So let's say we're in the Lancer, we're moving along pretty quickly, and we had a good feeling we were going to be able to overtake that person, or I'm not sorry, we shouldn't say overtake, because we're not literally passing them while we're in the traffic pattern. We're just going to be entering the pattern ahead of them. So I would say something like, let's see, King City traffic, Lancers entering left downwind on the 45, number 2 behind the Skyhawk, something like that. Let's say there's a Skyhawk over the fairgrounds about to turn base. The fact that we have said number 2 should be very informative to that person who's on the crosswind. That tells them that we anticipate being ahead of them. We don't need to spell it out necessarily, because you don't want to address every single pilot, but it's sort of giving them that extra bit of information as to what your plan is, to remove any kind of doubt. Or if they don't agree with it, then you have a discussion. But if you simply say we're entering left downwind, it doesn't really address the big question that the other person's going to have, which is, well, are you going to be ahead of me or are you going to be behind me? So if you have a good feeling about the sequencing and you have a plan, share that plan as briefly as possible. And simply adding the words number 2 conveys the plan relatively clearly, because that then implies that they're number 3, assuming they know about the guy who's number 1. So I've found that to be very, very helpful. It can really mean the difference between being confused about what the plan is and knowing exactly what the plan is, especially when you get up to, say, 3 or 4 airplanes. Okay, let's see. Jim asked the questions at a non-controlled tower with no traffic is supposed to overfly the field before entering the pattern. Can you describe the general strategy considering different approach directions? Yes, you are supposed to overfly the field. Well, let's see. You're supposed to determine what the runway is in use. That's what your goal is in overflying the field, is to determine the runway in use. So again, if there are 4 or 5 people in the pattern and they're all using that runway, chances are, there is an exception to this, which is when everyone's been playing the follow the leader game for too long, and the winds have changed and no one wants to recognize it, which happens at Lincoln Park all the time. But generally speaking, if there are 4 people in the pattern and they're all using the same runway, that is the wind is favoring the use of that runway. So you can be 10 miles out, and by using your ears, you can work out what the runway in use is. And there's very, very little advantage at that point in overflying the field. So I would not do it unless there's a reason to do it. But if you did want to overfly the field, let's say it's, there doesn't appear to be any weather reporting for King City, and let's say it's middle of the afternoon and there isn't a soul on the radio, and you genuinely don't know what the winds are doing, then you could simply overfly the field. So if we're approaching from Big Sur, we've just finished our sightseeing over at Big Sur, and we want to overfly the field to check it out. Let's see. I have a quick look. Big Sur is kind of an awkward direction. Depending, if you end up using runway 29er, it's really awkward to overfly the field because you have to get back over to here and then try and enter on the 45 again. So that could be a lot of maneuvering. I would probably, quite honestly, just enter on the 45 and set up for runway 29er if you're coming from the west. You can assume most of the time that the winds are generally out west here on the west coast. So I would enter on the 45 and just look for the windsock and see how things are looking. If you're coming from for Priest, could literally cross over the middle of the airport and then circle for the 45 for the left downwind. You could enter on a left crosswind, so where I'm moving my mouse right now, you could simply enter on a crosswind, look down at the field, look for the windsock, confirm that it is in fact runway 29er, and just fly the pattern by entering on the crosswind if you didn't want to maneuver for the 45. Okie dokie. All right, so we've successfully executed our plan. We landed number 3 at Mesa del Rey. We're feeling very good, and we're going to have lunch or an aerobatics lesson with Sean D. Tucker. I think Sean D. Tucker's school might be at King City, if memory serves. It's one of my favorite aerobatic pilots. Okay, so we've had lunch. Now we're ready to move on to scenario 1B. Which is from Mesa del Rey to Marina. This little puppy. Nestled in the bosom of a class Charlie and a class, anyone know? Salinas? Beulah? Yes, Reese has it. This is a class D. So we need to get from Mesa del Rey to Marina. And this time we are going to get flight following on this flight. Although I'm going to describe very, very quickly how you could do this without flight following, just so we make sure we completely understand how this airspace works, how you could legally do this flight without talking to a soul on the radio. Calvin, you said can't see? Okay. All right, so we're going from Mesa del Rey right now to Marina. Let's see. So, okay, let's have I'll throw it out to you guys. How could you do this flight without talking to anybody? Yeah, what altitudes? I'm going to draw the line of. So I'll do the lateral part, and someone tell me the vertical part. Yes. Yeah, the answers are streaming in pretty nicely. The 2500 idea is definitely good. Yep, we could do it under 2500 feet. I'm sorry, not Salinas. There we go. That route right there would not require you to talk to ATC if you stayed under 2500 feet. That's correct. Yeah, that's a good point. There is a tower at 3,600 feet, which is 226 feet AGL right here. So that's a really good point. It's kind of hard to be at 2,500 feet when the terrain is at 3,500 right here. All right, let's assume we do that flight real quick. It would be King City traffic, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, taking off runway 29 straight out departure, King City. Off we go. Flight. This is going to be tricky. You'll stay in the valley, keep the tall mountains. There's one at 4,500 feet. There's one at 3,500 feet. Fly basically level with the peaks, and then as you're approaching, as you see the ocean in the distance, and as you see the mountain range fading away, it's time to descend. That would be one way to do it. I would probably not do that. I would not do that because you're tinkering with the Monterey final. So while you're thinking you're being very clever, not talking to anyone, and isn't this great going underneath the radar, NorCal approach might be screaming bloody murder as they try and vector Learjets around you so they don't collide with you. So, okay, good. Yeah, people are saying it's wouldn't be a bad idea to talk to someone, or it doesn't look like fun. I'm actually glad you're saying that. Truthfully, when people try and avoid airspace, it's usually not because they're trying to be clever. It's at least in my opinion, it's because they are not comfortable talking to ATC and they'd rather not do it. So it's either a form of laziness or a form of fear. And laziness we can't do much about. But the fear part we can certainly do something about. So yeah, I would get the flight following. If you don't get the flight following, then at least make the call. If you don't get it right away, certainly as you get closer, make the call to NorCal approach. Can anyone guess how we could quickly find the frequency for who to talk to enter that Charlie airspace? Jim has it, the big red and white box right there, contact NorCal approach. So when you have these either class Bravo or class Charlie airspaces, they give you these very helpful boxes that give you suggested frequencies based on the approximate direction. We talked about that in the last workshop. If you go up to the corners of the sectional chart, you can also get the exact radials, if you like, out of that airport where those frequencies apply. But here it's really obvious. We're not going to call the 127.15 frequency that's for the west side. We'd call the one that's on the east. So that's easy enough. You could also look up the airport information for Salinas and get an approach frequency. You could look it up for Monterey. You could get it off the GPS. All of those would be good. Let's see. Chris had an interesting suggestion. You could fly over Salinas at 2,600 feet, then descend. That is true. Yes, you could change the route to something like this. That would do it. You could avoid Salinas or fly over it, and then once you're clear, descend. That would work. Just make sure you're below 2,500 feet beforehand. However, this is probably more work. We're gonna follow the highway, then we're gonna drift right. We're heading pretty far away from our destination at that point, and then we're gonna do 10 miles of flying that we really didn't have to do, all the while just skirting the Salinas airspace, where we're likely to get hit by a departure out of Salinas, or certainly be on the lookout for them. So technically correct. I actually thought it was a good idea when you suggested it, to be honest, and then now that I'm looking at it more closely, I would go with the original plan of just getting the flight following and just do whatever the approach controller says. The approach controller will, by the way, if your route of flight is going to take you anywhere near that Salinas Delta, it's likely that that approach controller would make a landline call to Salinas Tower and say, hey, Salinas, it's whatever the sector name is down here, Beach, or I've actually forgotten what the sector is, to be honest. He'll identify himself as the approach controller, which sector he is. I'm working Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, just going to transition the southwest corner of your airspace. What do you want me to do with him? And the Salinas might say, your control at or above 2,000, something like that. And then you might hear the approach controller tell you, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, maintain at or above 2,000. So you're allowed to transition or clip the Salinas Delta, and the controller has transparently coordinated it for you. But he's basically relaying the restriction that Salinas Tower would have given to him, which was at or above 2,000. Maybe he's protecting the traffic pattern that's going on at Salinas or something like that, because they're at, say, 1,500 feet or 1,200 feet, something like that. I see. So Chris's suggestion was maybe you could just fly directly over Salinas at 2,500. You could do that. You're going to have to probably hurry down quite a bit to get to the airport, though, and so you'd be starting your descent later than you normally would, but that could work. You just have to watch out for that, Charlie. Were you thinking something like that, Chris? Yep. So it's a little tricky. You've got to be above 2,500, but then before you can make a beeline for the airport, you have to get yourself under. So it's some pretty precise flying. All in all, just easier to be talking to someone, I think. That's interesting. Noon had an interesting point. He says, what's the best way to plan this flight? I see so much going on here. And Jim said it's hard because you have to be very aware of where you are. It's true. Yeah, at a glance, this looks a little bit frightening. Yeah, Reese says so much easier and stressful to talk to ATC. You're right. If you have the flight following, all of this stuff just kind of melts away, and it's just you in the airport. And if the controller needs you to turn or climb or descend, he'll let you know. That definitely helps. Okay, Moon, can you go ahead and let me know what would be your concern when you look at this? What sort of things jump out at you that kind of feel a little bit overwhelming? Okay, how the flight following works. Okay, gotcha. So it all comes down to for a given type of airspace, what are the communication requirements? So that's what we had at the summary at the beginning. So while we're in the echo, we don't need to talk to anyone. This compass rose just sort of adds to the confusion, but it doesn't actually denote airspace. So this compass rose doesn't exist in terms of planning. This dotted purple line is Class E down to the surface. Who cares? The Class C, we care about a great deal. The Salinas Class Delta, we care about a great deal. So these are the two circles that really matter, and they both cease to exist once we've met the communication requirements for this airspace. Andrew, there's the URL. So we can either stay out of those pieces of airspace just for our own planning, which is what we've been discussing at the beginning, or we can make our lives easier and a little bit safer in terms of getting some help with traffic that might be around us by getting the flight following. So simply saying NorCal approach, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo is, let me see, I apologize, I'm starting to talk before I've actually really thought about the call. Let's see, what's a good reporting point? We might just tell them let's say we're over SAM4 or we're over Highway 101, somewhere around here. Prior to making this call, you would use the GPS most likely or whatever equipment you have to work out how far you are from an airport or a VOR. I do this very frequently in my plane if I'm picking up flight following. Instead of a geographic reference, it's almost certainly going to be quicker for the controller to just deal with a distance from a VOR or an airport. So NorCal approach Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo is 15 southeast of Salinas VOR inbound for landing Marina. That's it. And the controller will then give you a squawk code. So it'll say, let's see, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, NorCal approach, squawk 1234 and ident, the Monterey Altimeter 3012. So you squawk 1234, you ident, your target then blinks on his screen. That's what the ident does, makes you stand out like a sore thumb. No, you would not need to ask for flight following. Given your position and where Marina is, the fact that it underlies the outer shelf of the outer core of the Charlie, it's clear that you're establishing communication with ATC for the purpose of transitioning this airspace to land there. So no, I would not say request flight following to Marina. It's not the end of the world to do it, but it's not particularly important. It would be different if you were calling 15 southeast of Salinas to get flight following to Napa, which is, say, 100 miles northwest of here. I'd definitely say, we'd like advisories or request flight following, so you can say request advisories to Napa, request flight following to Napa. Either one of those is fine. Request flight following to Marina is also okay, but I would say just landing Marina would do the job here too. And then see what they say. They might say, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, remain outside the Class Charlie airspace. So, it could be that there's just a gaggle of Learjets that are being vectored around here, and he doesn't have a safe way for you to enter the Charlie. Yes, Mark, that's a great point. The basics of just saying who you are, where you are, and what you'd like to do, or in this case where you're going, will really go a long way. So don't try and remember a script necessarily. Just if you can picture what does the controller need from me to be able to provide me service, he needs to know where you are, where it is you're going to be going, and it's very helpful for him to know his altitude. If you do not include your altitude in the call, at some point you're going to hear the controller say altitude, because that's a requirement as part of radar identifying you. He has to correlate the altitude that he sees on his scope with what altitude you think you're at, just in case something is wrong somewhere. Does he need to know the final destination or next intersection or a VOR, etc.? In this day and age, they'll pretty much be expecting you to go GPS direct. Quite honestly, when you're VFR, I always get a confused controller talking to me on the other end when they find out I'm navigating using lakes and rivers and roads. So if you're going to be taking a course which looks nothing like a direct route to Marina, so if you had planned to go via Hollister first or out along the coast to Big Sur, definitely let him know that that's what you'd be doing. So you could say we're over 15 southeast of Salinas. I wouldn't do this all on the first call. I'd say landing Marina, then he'll give you the information, and then say approach Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo. Just that alone. That tells him that you have a message for him, but you want to kind of get his attention, and basically you just saying your call sign and his call sign is a shortcut for saying, hey, I've got something I need to ask you that's relatively low priority. Is this a good time? So you say approach Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, and he might ignore you and issue 4 vectors to other planes first. Then he'll get to you. Say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, NorCal. And so now he's waiting for you. He's all ears. NorCal 3 Alpha Bravo, we're planning on heading, going to go to Big Sur along the coastline, landing Marina. That changes things, right? Now he knows where it is you're going to be going. It's quite different than the direct route that he was thinking you would do. And he'd say, okay, Roger, maintain at or above 3,000, or maintain at or below 3,000. Whatever he needs to do to keep you away from those IFR jets, which are arriving. Always picture straight lines going to and from the airport along those runways. So we've got jets departing most likely. Prevailing winds are out of the west here on the west coast, so most likely departing expensive Learjets and Gulfstreams. Monterey's a well-to-do area with a nice airport. So you can have jets going off that way and then turning left or right. And you can have jets arriving from here. Probably not too many jets coming over these mountains necessarily because it's pretty close to the airport. So they'll probably be getting vectored more out here in the valley, I would think, but I could be wrong. I'd say you're probably pretty safe over here over the coast. But if you pick a course, if you say I want to go present position, direct Monterey, direct Marina, now we have a problem. Now you're literally chugging along the localizer at an altitude which at some point will be a conflict for somebody. So if you try and just picture the planes going in and out of that airport, try and decide whether your route that you'd like to do is going to be in conflict with that or not. And even if it is in conflict, just tell the controller what you'd like to do. Don't despair. and let them know what you'd like to do, and then they'll give you an altitude that will work for them. You know, maybe at or above 4,000 or at or below 2,000, whatever the number is. They'll try and make it work, or they'll say that's not going to work. I need you to remain 5 south of the airport, or I need you to remain outside of the extended centerline for the 2/8. So Mooney, you feeling a little better about it right now? Cool. So Mark said, so after an initial quick contact, NorCal approach Cessna 1 Alpha Bravo 15 Southeast Salinas, level 3,500 landing Marina. Yep, that could work. Yep, I agree. Let's see. And Frank says, following Mark's call of NorCal approach to say stay clear of Class Charlie airspace, what about the Delta? Can you elaborate that on what do you mean by that, Frank? Are you cleared through the... I see. If you're talking to NorCal, then yes, they are legally obliged to coordinate your transition silently with Salinas. If for some reason they are not able to do that, or they're too busy to do that, they will actually explicitly tell you, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, remain clear of the Salinas class Delta, or remain outside the Salinas Delta airspace. But otherwise, if you're talking with the approach controller, practically speaking, you can enter the Salinas Delta. By letter of the law, you might want to do your own research on it, but by letter of the law, I believe you actually do need to be in contact with the tower. So let's say the tower is the controlling agency for this airspace, and the regs say that you would need to be in contact with the tower prior to entering that airspace. However, knowing that by talking to ATC, i.e. the Monterey approach controller right here, if you're in communication with that approach controller, he has an obligation to coordinate your transition in the background with Salinas. So if he does not do that and you end up busting the Delta, you would actually have recourse for saying, well, I was under the impression that it had been coordinated, and you could point to the line in the controller's rulebook that says that he should have coordinated that. Let's see. Yeah, you would not. That's right. Yeah, you would not go and coordinate your own transition with the Delta. That's why it's not practical. So if you're planning, let's go with our original plan. If you're planning on coming from Highway 101 and basically going for a straight shot, possibly clipping the edge of the Salinas Delta, it is simply not practical for you to say, NorCal, I'll be right back. I got to go talk to Salinas. That's not going to happen. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help you, and NorCal is going to be quicker at coordinating that. They have a button they can press which gets them the hot wire over to Salinas Tower. It's literally one button. So they will do that transparently and silently in the background for you. The only time it would be, the only time you might get yourself in some trouble, let's say we're coming from Watsonville, and which is up here, and we say we're landing Marina. There is no real reason that you should end up penetrating the Salinas class Delta. So let's say you're wandering along the coast, and the controller is just waiting for you basically to tell him that you have Marina in sight. Then he's going to say squawk VFR frequency change approved. So he's cutting you loose so you can start making announcements on the Marina CTAF. What if while you were over Moss Landing, you suddenly and silently decided to go on a scenic tour of the inner valley here and at 1,500 feet and plow through the Salinas Delta? Practically speaking, there was no expectation on the controller's behalf that you were going to get near the Salinas Delta, so he probably wouldn't have coordinated it, and you're probably going to get in some trouble. But if you're coming from over here, it's much more reasonable that you would be doing it. So the controllers are smart about this. They see where you are, where you're going, and they make a prediction about whether they need to coordinate it or not. If you're anywhere near that Delta, they'll pick up the line and say, Salinas, I'm working a Skyhawk. It's going to be direct Marina. And what do you need me to do with them? Or there might even be letters of agreement that say that NorCal Approach has control of traffic within the Salinas, south of the Salinas Airport, within the Delta at or above 2,000. Those agreements exist as well. where they kind of stratify the airspace. You can't see it as the pilot. It can happen in the background. So basically just use common sense. If your route of flight, if your understood route of flight, or what the controller understands to be your route of flight, is going to take you anywhere near that delta, they'll take care of it for you. If they do not have time, then they will explicitly tell you, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, remain clear of the Salinas Delta. That either means that Salinas said no, or he's too busy to coordinate it, or something else is going on. So unless they tell you explicitly to stay out of it, then if your route of flight is obviously going to take you near it, then don't worry about it too much. I have explicitly asked controllers before when I have flight following. I'll say, you know, am I okay to go through the delta? And every single time they get kind of hissy with me. I was going to use another word, but hissy is a little bit more professional. They make it clear that I'm wasting their time, and I should have known that they would coordinate this. So because it's in their rule book that says they have to coordinate it, I think they assume that all pilots know their rule too, which they don't. And so, you know, as a pilot, I'm getting nervous that I'm coming up on a delta and I'm not talking to the guy who officially owns the delta. So it's kind of it's an odd situation where the rules that we go by are actually different than what the controllers go by. So it's good to know what the practical working way of doing this is, and that is don't bother them with asking about the delta. Okay, let's see. I'm going to add the two questions. Andrew says, so NorCal approach supersedes a class delta airspace like Salinas. Formal regulations about what supersedes what. I know that wasn't what you meant in this case, but I wanted to address that. And there's no physical overlap between them. Yes, practically speaking, if you are in communication with NorCal approach, the Salinas Delta ceases to exist unless they tell you that it exists. That's probably the best way of putting it. And when I say it ceases to exist if your logical route of flight is going to take you there. Again, let's take the Watsonville to Marina example. If you silently surprise the controller at 200 knots and go sightseeing over to the Chula NDB because you'd like to see this NDB before it gets shut down like every other NDB in the country. Without saying anything, you just plow through the Salinas Delta at 1,000 feet. They're going to want to have words with you about it. But other than that, the Salinas goes away. Let's see, that was Andrew's question. And Jim said, in this case, I've told to stay clear of the class Charlie and Delta, where would we go? I would change the plan then. If the Monterey approach controller is just stupidly busy and has no way of getting us through his airspace and can't coordinate the transition, he's not going to say remain clear of the Charlie and the Delta. All he will say, the worst thing he could say to you is remain clear of the Charlie, frequency change approved. That would be a very, very bad day for that to happen, but it could happen. He could say remain of the Charlie for now, call me back in 5 minutes. That's more likely to be the worst case scenario. We may not want to do that. So in either of those two cases, let's assume we're going to give up with NorCal approach, and this becomes like a giant fence that we can't pass through. The NorCal controller is absolutely not going to say, remain clear of the Salinas class Delta. He doesn't care whether you go through the Delta if you can coordinate that. So, you know, if he's told you to stay clear of the Charlie, frequency change approved, okay, see you later. Now we're going to call Salinas Tower. Salinas Tower, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, 10 miles southeast, landing Marina. Then I'll say, okay, very likely you'll hear Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, Salinas Tower, roger, transition approved at or above 2000, Salinas altimeter, 3012. So now he's giving you you're allowed to enter the Salinas Delta. He's given you an altitude restriction at or above 2,000, and the reason he's doing that might be because there's traffic in the pattern. He's trying to keep you vertically apart from them to make everybody's life simple. So now you've got a little window. You're allowed to be above 2,000 to cross through the Delta, but you cannot get up to 2,500 because we're not in communication with the controller that runs the Charlie. So the Charlie is still forbidden, but now we have our transition through the Salinas Delta. So that's the fallback position, would be to transition it yourself. It could be that's what you planned from the beginning, for example. If you are if your vertical profile called for you to be fairly low and you know what, I'm probably going to spend more time in the Salinas Delta than I am the Charlie, maybe you plan that from the very beginning that you're just going to call Salinas for the transition. Hey Peter, congratulations. Only took 2 hours and 10 minutes to find the chat window. Okay, let's see. Moon has said, can you quickly, I can't do anything quickly as you can see, run through the way you would plan and execute this flight, then run through the comms, or is that too much to do at this point? Well, Peter, I was just teasing you, it's fine. We can. Let's see. Yeah, we're not going to be able to get through the remaining scenarios, so we will we'll just call that now that we won't go through the other. I'm going to try and be smart about this. We'll table the other scenarios for now, and we can call it a day on this because we are just over the 2-hour mark. And I'm happy to, as a Q&A, I'll tell you what, Moon. Let's do it that way. As a Q&A item. Yes, Chris, this is being recorded. As a Q&A item, I can go through that particular flight if you like, or if the group specifically wants me to go through that flight, we can do that. Otherwise, if people are generally ready to move on from that flight, then I'll just open the floor for regular Q&A. And if you're able to hang out, then I can run you through that flight as the last Q&A item. Okay, so I'll tell you what then. Since it's we're going with Plan B, which is to not continue with the other scenarios for now. Let's do what I said we would do. Let's take the break. Let's take a couple of minutes to relax, gather some thoughts around questions, and then we'll come back. Let's say at I've got 14 past the hour. Let's start at 19 past. So we'll get exactly 5 minutes, and then we'll come back with questions. And if Moon wants to go through the flight, still wants to go through the flight, we will do that.